Please don't embarrass me tonight." Those were the first words my husband said to me before we stepped out of the car and into the most important event of his career. Not, "You look beautiful." Not, "Thank you for coming." Just that quiet warning spoken while adjusting the cuffs of his tuxedo beneath the glowing lights of the Grand Crescent Hotel in downtown Chicago. I remember staring at my reflection in the passenger window for a second after he said it. My silver hair was pinned neatly at the back of my neck. The navy satin dress I wore was 23 years old, but still elegant. I had carefully sewn the loose beadwork back into place 2 nights earlier while sitting alone in our kitchen. Richard used to love that dress. Back when he still looked at me like I mattered. "I'll stay out of the way," I said softly, smoothing invisible wrinkles from my gloves. He didn't answer. He was already checking his phone again. The valet opened my door, and the cold November wind wrapped around my shoulders as I stepped onto the red carpet leading into the ballroom. Cameras flashed near the entrance. Men in tailored suits laughed loudly, while women in glittering gowns posed beside floral arrangements taller than I was. The entire evening smelled like expensive perfume, champagne, and polished marble. Richard walked several steps ahead of me the entire time. He didn't offer me his arm. Inside the ballroom, crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls from the ceiling. Every table glowed beneath candlelight. Waiters moved silently through the crowd, carrying silver trays filled with champagne flutes. A jazz trio played softly near the stage. The company logo rotated slowly across giant screens at the front of the room, beside the words Carter Global Innovations 25th Anniversary Gala. 25 years. I stared at those words longer than I should have. 25 years earlier, Richard and I had been sitting at a tiny kitchen table in Milwaukee with overdue bills stacked beside us, and exactly $312 left in our checking account. I had typed his first business proposal on a second-hand IBM computer while our son slept upstairs in a crib missing one wheel. But tonight, none of that history seemed to belong to me anymore. A young woman wearing a gold blazer approached us near the entrance with a clipboard in her hands. "Mr. Carter, welcome," she said brightly. Then her eyes shifted toward me. "And your guest?" Guest. The word landed harder than it should have. Richard didn't hesitate. "Just give her a standard badge," he replied casually. "Her. Not my wife. Not Evelyn. Just her." The woman printed my name onto a plain white badge while handing Richard a black executive pass attached to a silk ribbon. His included gold lettering. Mine didn't even include our last name. Evelyn. Guest. I pinned it onto my dress with steady hands, even though my chest suddenly felt tight. Richard leaned closer then lowered his voice. "The investors tonight are very image-conscious," he murmured. "Vanessa will mostly be representing the family publicly this evening. Vanessa, our daughter-in-law, 38 years old, blonde, polished, always dressed like she belonged on magazine covers and airport lounges. She had spent the last 5 years slowly positioning herself beside Richard at every public event while I quietly disappeared into the background. Of course, I whispered. I understand. And I did understand. More than he realized. Across the ballroom, I spotted Vanessa instantly. She stood near the stage wearing a silver gown covered in tiny crystals that reflected the chandelier lights every time she moved. One hand rested lightly on the arm of my son, Daniel, while she laughed at something one of the board members said. Richard smiled the moment he saw them. A real smile. Warm, proud, effortless. I couldn't remember the last time he had smiled at me that way. "There's my star," he said under his breath before walking toward them. I stayed where I was. No one noticed. People brushed past me carrying champagne glasses and auction brochures, while conversations rose and fell around me like waves. I suddenly felt very old standing there alone beneath all that gold light. "Mrs. Carter," a waiter asked politely as he offered me champagne. For a second, hearing someone call me that almost hurt more. I took a glass just to keep my hands occupied. From across the ballroom, I watched Vanessa place her hand gently on Richard's shoulder while introducing him to a circle of investors from New York. Every few seconds, photographers snapped pictures. Vanessa always stood in the center. Richard beside her, Daniel smiling nearby. They looked like the perfect modern executive family. Clean, stylish, ambitious. There simply wasn't space in that image for a 67-year-old woman wearing last decade's satin dress. I moved quietly toward the back of the ballroom, where the smaller tables were arranged beside the service hallway. My assigned seat sat directly beside the kitchen doors. Table 26. I looked toward the center of the room, where Richard's table stood beneath a massive arrangement of white orchids. Table 1. Reserved for executives and family. Family. I almost laughed at that. A woman around my age sat across from me, wearing a lavender scarf and orthopedic shoes. "Are you with the catering staff's relatives too?" she asked kindly. Before I could answer, applause suddenly erupted near the stage. Richard had stepped behind the podium. The lights dimmed around the ballroom as giant screens illuminated his face. 25 years ago, he began confidently. This company started with one simple dream. I froze, because I already knew the story he was about to tell. I had heard it hundreds of times over the years. The struggling entrepreneur, the sleepless nights, the sacrifice, the determination. Every version always sounded as though Richard had built everything entirely alone. Tonight was no different. "I took a risk," he said proudly while guests listened with admiration. "And through hard work, persistence, and vision, I built something that changed my family's future forever." I lowered my eyes to the untouched champagne in my hands. He never mentioned the woman who worked overnight bookkeeping shifts while pregnant because they couldn't afford rent. He never mentioned the wedding ring I sold so he could make payroll during the company's second year. He never mentioned who stayed awake typing contracts at 3 in the morning after feeding a crying baby. In Richard's version of history, I had slowly faded into the wallpaper years ago. Applause thundered through the ballroom again. Vanessa rose first to clap for him. Cameras flashed wildly. Richard smiled modestly before stepping away from the podium. Then something unexpected happened. Near the ballroom entrance, a quiet stir moved through the crowd. Conversations softened. Heads turned. Even Richard stopped smiling for a second. A tall, gray-haired man had just entered beside 2 security guards. Daniel Reeves, CEO of Reeves International Holdings. One of the most powerful businessmen in America. I recognized him instantly, even though I had not seen him in nearly 20 years. My fingers tightened around the champagne glass. Daniel looked older now, of course. His hair had turned silver. Deep lines framed his eyes. But he still carried himself with that same calm presence I remembered from long ago. The entire room shifted around him. Executives hurried forward to greet him. Richard straightened his jacket immediately and began weaving through the crowd toward the entrance with Vanessa beside him. Everyone wanted Daniel Reeves' attention tonight. But the moment he stepped fully into the ballroom, he stopped walking. His eyes moved slowly across the room, searching, confused almost. Then suddenly, unbelievably, they landed directly on me, standing beside table 26 near the kitchen doors. He froze, completely froze. I felt my heartbeat stumble painfully in my chest as he stared at me across the crowded ballroom. Richard was already extending his hand toward him, smiling broadly. "Daniel, it's an honor to finally have you here tonight." But Daniel barely looked at him. His eyes never left mine. Then, in front of every executive, investor, photographer, and board member in that ballroom, Daniel Reeves stepped past my husband entirely and started walking straight toward me. The sound of clinking champagne glasses slowly disappeared behind the pounding in my ears as Daniel Reeves crossed the ballroom toward me. Every person in that room noticed it. Conversations stopped halfway through sentences. A waiter nearly collided with another server because both of them had turned to stare. Even the jazz trio near the stage faltered for a second before awkwardly continuing their song. Richard remained frozen near the podium with his hand still partially extended in the air where he had expected Daniel to shake it. Vanessa looked confused at first, then worried. I stood beside table 26 gripping my champagne glass so tightly I was afraid it might crack in my hand. Daniel stopped directly in front of me. Up close, I could see the age in his face more clearly now. Time had softened him, but not weakened him. His gray eyes searched mine carefully, almost disbelievingly. "Evelyn Carter," he said quietly. "It really is you." I opened my mouth, but for a second no words came out. 20 years vanished in an instant. I was no longer standing in a glittering ballroom in Chicago. I was back in a cramped office with stained carpet and flickering fluorescent lights, sitting across from a younger Daniel Reeves while stacks of unpaid invoices covered his desk. Back then, nobody would have recognized his name either. "Hello, Daniel," I finally whispered. His face broke into a genuine smile, the kind I had not seen directed toward me in a very long time. "I have been looking for you for years." Around us, Cameras immediately started flashing again. Richard hurried forward at last, his polished executive smile stretched too tightly across his face now. "Daniel," he interrupted carefully, "I did not realize you and Evelyn knew each other." Daniel turned slowly toward him then. The warmth in his expression cooled noticeably. "Knew each other," he repeated. "Richard, your wife practically saved my company." Silence swallowed the ballroom. I felt dozens of eyes turn toward me all at once. Richard gave a short laugh, the kind people use when they are trying to recover control of a situation before anyone notices they are panicking. "Well," he said lightly, "Evelyn has always been supportive." Supportive. Such a small word for 25 years of sacrifice. Daniel looked back at me instead of answering him. "Supportive?" he said softly. "That is not exactly how I remember it." Vanessa appeared beside Richard then, elegant and smiling in that controlled way she always did whenever cameras were nearby. "Mr. Reeves," she said sweetly, extending her hand, "I am Vanessa Carter. We are honored to finally meet you." Daniel shook her hand politely without much interest. "Of course," he replied. Then his attention returned to me again. "Evelyn," he said, "would you walk with me for a moment?" The entire room seemed to inhale at once. I glanced instinctively toward Richard. His jaw tightened almost invisibly. For years, I had trained myself to read the smallest changes in his face. The slight narrowing of his eyes when something threatened his image. The twitch near his temple when he lost control of a conversation. He was angry now, not openly. Richard never lost composure publicly. But beneath that carefully tailored tuxedo, I could feel his irritation building. "Actually," Richard interrupted smoothly. "Daniel, the board members are waiting near the stage. We should probably discuss the expansion presentation before dinner." Daniel barely looked at him. "They can wait." Then he offered me his arm. Nobody had offered me their arm all evening. Not even my own husband. I hesitated only briefly before placing my hand lightly against Daniel's sleeve. A strange murmur spread quietly through the ballroom as we walked away from table 26 together. I could feel people watching us from every direction. Whispers already spreading. Who is she? What did he mean by saved his company? Why did nobody know this? Daniel guided me toward a quieter hallway just outside the ballroom, where enormous windows overlooked the Chicago skyline glittering beneath the cold November sky. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I suddenly became very aware of how old my dress felt against my skin, how carefully I had tried all evening to disappear. Daniel leaned against the window slightly and studied me with something close to sadness in his expression. "You vanished," he said finally. "After everything that happened, you just disappeared." I folded my hands carefully in front of me. Life became busy. He gave a quiet laugh under his breath. "That sounds exactly like something you would say." Through the ballroom doors behind us, I could still hear the distant sound of music and conversation. But out here, everything felt strangely calm. "I heard about Carter Global becoming successful years ago," Daniel continued. "I assumed eventually I would see your name somewhere attached to it." I smiled faintly. "You know Richard?" Daniel's eyes sharpened slightly at that. "Yes," he said carefully. "I believe I do now." A waiter passed by offering champagne again, but Daniel waved him away absent-mindedly. "Do you remember Cleveland?" he asked suddenly. I looked out at the skyline for a moment before nodding slowly. "The manufacturing conference?" "The worst conference in American history," he corrected with a smile. "The hotel lost power for 6 hours. Half the investors walked out." I laughed quietly before I could stop myself. The sound surprised me. I had not laughed naturally in a very long time. "You spilled coffee all over your presentation notes," I reminded him. "And you rewrote the entire proposal overnight from memory," he replied immediately. "You stayed awake until 4 in the morning helping me fix everything." I shrugged lightly. "You were panicking." "I was 28 years old and 2 weeks from bankruptcy," he said. "You walked into that disaster wearing a wool coat covered in snow and somehow convinced a room full of investors to give me another chance." I looked down at my hands. My wedding ring reflected softly beneath the hallway lights. "That was a long time ago." Daniel was quiet for a second. "You know," he said carefully, "I told that story for years." I frowned slightly. "What story?" "The woman who understood business better than anyone else in the room while pretending she was just there supporting her husband." Something tightened painfully in my chest. Because once upon a time, before the company dinners and press photos and polished executive image, Richard used to say things like that too. He used to ask my opinion before every meeting. Used to leave handwritten notes beside my coffee cup thanking me for believing in him. Somewhere along the way, gratitude had quietly transformed into embarrassment. I had simply become too old for the image he wanted beside him. Richard built a successful company, I said softly after a moment. Daniel looked at me carefully. Did he? The question lingered heavily between us. Before I could answer, the ballroom doors opened suddenly behind us. Vanessa approached first, still smiling, though the strain in her face was easier to see now. Richard followed several steps behind her. There you both are, Vanessa said brightly. Everyone is waiting for dinner service to begin. Daniel straightened slightly. We were just catching up. Vanessa glanced toward me briefly before speaking again. Mr. Reeves, Richard was hoping to introduce you to some of the investors from San Francisco. Daniel remained calm. In a moment, Vanessa's smile tightened slightly. Richard finally stepped forward then. Evelyn, he said quietly, why do not you head back to the table? Not our table. The table. Table 26 beside the kitchen doors. I looked at him for several seconds before answering. And for the first time all evening, something inside me shifted. Very small, very quiet, but real. Because standing there beneath the soft hallway lights while one powerful man remembered exactly who I was and another desperately tried to hide me again, I suddenly realized something painful. Richard had spent years convincing me that disappearing was graceful, but maybe I had simply been erased slowly enough not to notice. Richard stared at me for a long moment after telling me to return to my table. The expression on his face was controlled, polished, almost calm to anyone else watching. But after 42 years of marriage, I knew every version of his silence. This one meant danger. Not physical danger. Reputation danger. The kind Richard feared most. I looked at him quietly before smoothing one hand over the front of my dress. Of course, I said softly. Daniel Reeves glanced between us, noticing far more than either of us wanted him to. Actually, Daniel said, I was hoping Evelyn would join me at the executive table tonight. The air changed immediately. Vanessa blinked once, too quickly. Richard forced a smile that looked painful around the edges. Well, he said carefully. The seating arrangements were finalized weeks ago. Daniel's expression never shifted. Then I suppose they can be adjusted. Vanessa recovered first. She always did. That is incredibly generous, she said smoothly, touching Richard's arm lightly. But we would hate to create confusion for the staff this late into the evening. Staff. Confusion. Such polite little words hiding panic underneath them. Daniel remained perfectly calm. I think they will manage. For a second, nobody spoke. I could hear the distant sound of silverware being arranged inside the ballroom as dinner service prepared to begin. Somewhere nearby, a woman laughed too loudly at something unimportant. Life continued around us while my entire understanding of the last 20 years slowly cracked apart. Richard adjusted his cufflinks, a habit he had whenever he needed time to think. Evelyn prefers quieter tables anyway, he said finally. Do not you? He answered for me before I could speak. The same way he had answered for me for years. I used to think it was partnership, then consideration, then habit. Standing there now, I finally recognized it for what it truly was. Erasure. Daniel looked directly at me. What would you prefer, Evelyn? Nobody had asked me that question in a very long time. Not sincerely. Not publicly. I felt strangely unsteady all of a sudden. I do not want to cause problems, I said carefully. Richard relaxed slightly beside Vanessa, but Daniel's gaze stayed fixed on mine. That was not what I asked. The hallway grew very quiet. I looked down briefly at the plain white guest badge pinned against my old navy dress. Evelyn. Guest. 25 years helping build a company, and somehow I had become a guest inside my own life. I would like to sit wherever I am actually wanted, I said softly. Something flickered across Daniel's face then. Respect maybe. Or sadness. Richard immediately laughed lightly as though everything had become perfectly normal again. Well then, he said quickly, that settles it. But nothing felt settled. Not anymore. Daniel offered me his arm once again, and this time I accepted without hesitation. As we walked back into the ballroom together, conversations visibly shifted around us like waves moving through water. Heads turned. Whispers spread. I caught fragments floating through the air as we passed. Who is she? Did he say she saved his company? Why have we never seen her before? Richard and Vanessa followed several steps behind us now instead of ahead. It was subtle, small enough that many people probably would not notice. But I noticed. For years, I had walked behind them. Suddenly the positions had reversed, and none of them knew how to handle it. Daniel guided me toward table 1 beneath the towering white orchids near the center of the ballroom. Every seat around it belonged to people whose names appeared regularly in financial magazines and television interviews. Billionaires, investors, politicians, people who shaped entire industries with quiet conversations over expensive wine. A young event coordinator hurried toward us looking pale. "Mr. Reeves," she whispered nervously, "there are not enough place settings here for another guest." Daniel smiled politely. "Then remove mine." "Absolutely not," the woman stammered. "I will fix it immediately." She rushed away before he could say another word. I almost smiled despite myself. Daniel pulled out a chair for me beside his own seat at the center of the table. The movement drew immediate attention from nearby guests. Respect mattered in rooms like this. Placement mattered. Who sat beside whom mattered. Richard understood that better than anyone, which was exactly why I could feel his humiliation growing stronger with every passing second. Vanessa sat across from me eventually, elegant and perfectly composed, though I noticed she no longer smiled quite as naturally as before. Richard settled beside her, speaking quietly with one of the investors while avoiding my eyes completely. Dinner service began moments later. Plates arrived decorated so beautifully they barely looked edible. Tiny filet medallions. Roasted vegetables arranged like artwork. Wine poured carefully into crystal glasses. Around the table, conversations flowed smoothly about mergers, overseas expansion, and market forecasts. But every few minutes, someone found a way to ask Daniel about me without directly asking. "So how exactly did you and Mrs. Carter meet?" one investor finally asked with a polite smile. Daniel took a sip of wine before answering. "Through intelligence," he said simply. Silence followed. The investor laughed awkwardly. "Well, that sounds mysterious." Daniel glanced toward me. 20 years ago, I was preparing to lose everything. Evelyn walked into a conference room and solved a logistics problem my entire executive team had failed to fix for 6 months. Several people at the table looked surprised. Richard focused very carefully on cutting his steak. "I was not alone," I said quietly. Daniel smiled faintly. "You always say that." Vanessa folded her napkin carefully into her lap. "I had no idea you worked in the business side of things, Evelyn." "Worked?" As though I had briefly helped organize office supplies once upon a time. "She practically built the operational structure we still use," Daniel replied before I could answer. Vanessa blinked. Richard finally spoke then. "Evelyn was very helpful during the early years." Helpful. Again that word. Like I had occasionally baked cookies for office meetings instead of sacrificing decades of my life, helping him survive. Daniel looked at Richard for several seconds before asking quietly, "Why did she stop?" The question settled heavily across the table. I saw Richard's shoulders stiffen slightly. Vanessa reached for her wine glass too quickly. "Family priorities changed," Richard answered smoothly. Daniel was young. Someone needed to stay home more. I almost laughed then. Not because the answer was funny. Because it was incomplete in exactly the way Richard always preferred truth to be. Yes, I stayed home more. But I also continued balancing payroll records from our kitchen table after midnight, while helping Daniel with homework and folding laundry. I edited contracts while recovering from pneumonia. I handled angry suppliers while sitting beside hospital beds when Richard traveled for work. I disappeared publicly so he could appear successful privately. There is a difference. Daniel seemed to understand that without me saying it aloud. "That was a very expensive loss for the business," he said quietly. Richard gave a tight smile. "Things worked out well enough." "Did they?" Daniel asked calmly. The table fell silent again. Across the ballroom, a large screen displayed photographs celebrating Carter Global's 25-year history. Richard shaking hands with politicians. Richard at ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Richard on magazine covers. Richard receiving awards. In every photograph, I was either absent completely or standing somewhere behind him blurred into the background. I stared at the screen while dessert plates arrived. Lemon cake with sugared raspberries. Richard's favorite. Once upon a time, I used to bake it from scratch every year for his birthday. "Evelyn," Daniel said softly beside me. I turned toward him. "You should know something." His voice lowered slightly. "Several years ago, I tried contacting you after your article on manufacturing efficiency was anonymously published in Midwest Business Review. My heart skipped painfully. I remembered that article. I had written it late one night after Richard fell asleep. I submitted it anonymously because Richard laughed when he saw me working on it. Nobody cares what retired housewives think about supply chains, he had said casually before turning off the kitchen light. I never received anything, I whispered. Daniel frowned slightly. My office sent 3 letters. Slowly, very slowly, I turned my head toward Richard. He did not look at me. He continued drinking wine while staring straight ahead at the ballroom stage. And suddenly I understood something even more painful than being hidden tonight. This had not started tonight. Richard had not been slowly forgetting me. He had been deliberately removing me piece by piece for years. Richard continued staring at the stage after Daniel mentioned the letters. He did not deny it. That was the part that hurt most. Not the possibility that he had intercepted them. The certainty settling quietly into my chest while he calmly sipped wine beneath the ballroom lights. Across the table, Vanessa adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist and forced a pleasant smile toward one of the investors nearby, but I noticed how tense her shoulders had become. She was listening carefully now. Everyone at the table was. Daniel leaned slightly closer toward me. You truly never received any of them? He asked quietly. I shook my head once. No, he frowned. That does not make sense. I personally instructed my assistant to send invitations to speak at 2 conferences and 1 consulting opportunity in Boston. Boston. I remembered that year clearly. Richard had suddenly become strangely irritated any time I spent too long working at the kitchen table. One night, I had mentioned wanting to attend a business seminar downtown, and he laughed softly while loosening his tie. At this stage in life? He asked casually, Evelyn, you should let younger people chase those things. At the time, I thought he was trying to protect me from disappointment. Now, sitting beneath crystal chandeliers while wealthy strangers quietly watched my marriage unravel one careful sentence at a time, I realized something much colder. He had not been protecting me. He had been protecting the version of himself that only existed if I stayed invisible. Richard always handled the mail, I said finally. The silence after that sentence felt heavier than any accusation. Daniel did not respond immediately. He simply nodded once as though pieces of a puzzle had finally settled into place. Around us, the ballroom continued glowing with effortless luxury. Waiters cleared dessert plates while soft jazz drifted through the room. But table 1 had changed completely now. Earlier in the evening, I had been decoration. Background. A quiet older woman nobody bothered noticing. Now people kept glancing toward me with curiosity they could no longer hide. One of the board members cleared his throat awkwardly. Mrs. Carter, he asked politely, were you involved with Carter Global during the startup years? I almost smiled at the careful wording. Involved. Another soft word people use when they suspect the truth might be uncomfortable. Before I could answer, Richard finally spoke. Evelyn helped where she could while raising Daniel. Daniel Reeves set down his wine glass gently. That is a remarkably small way to describe someone who designed half your operational systems. Richard's expression tightened almost invisibly again. Businesses evolve. Integrity should not, Daniel replied calmly. Nobody moved after that. The tension around the table became impossible to ignore. Vanessa reached for her water glass this time instead of wine. Her lipstick remained perfectly untouched against the crystal rim. I suddenly realized how carefully she managed every detail of herself. Every smile, every photograph, every public interaction. She and Richard had more in common than I once allowed myself to admit. I think there is probably some misunderstanding here, Vanessa said smoothly after a moment. Richard speaks about Evelyn very highly at home. Daniel looked at her politely. Does he? I lowered my eyes before anyone could study my face too closely. Because the truth was complicated. Richard had not transformed into a cruel man overnight. That would have been easier to survive. Instead, it happened slowly, quietly, one tiny dismissal at a time. At first, he simply stopped asking my opinion during business discussions. Then he stopped mentioning my contributions during interviews. Eventually, he stopped introducing me properly at company events altogether. Somewhere along the line, I became my wife instead of Evelyn. Then eventually, just her. The loss happened gradually enough that I kept convincing myself it was normal. Marriage changes after decades together, I told myself. People grow tired. Priorities shift. But now, sitting across from him while another man remembered my work more clearly than my own husband did, I could no longer pretend I had simply imagined the disappearance. A large screen near the stage suddenly changed slides again, displaying an old black-and-white photograph from the company's early years. Richard stood in front of the first Carter Global warehouse wearing rolled-up sleeves and a proud grin. Several employees surrounded him holding cardboard boxes. I froze the moment I saw the image, because partially hidden near the edge of the photograph was me. Younger, thinner, carrying 2 accounting binders against my chest while balancing a coffee cup in one hand. The camera had almost cropped me out entirely. "That warehouse in Milwaukee," Daniel said softly while noticing my expression. "You negotiated that lease yourself, did you not?" Richard immediately answered before I could. It was a joint effort. Daniel ignored him completely. The landlord was refusing the contract unless someone guaranteed 6 additional months personally. Slowly, memories returned with painful clarity. I remembered sitting across from that landlord in a tiny office that smelled like cigarette smoke and burnt coffee. Richard had been panicking quietly beside me because we could not afford the increase. So I offered the landlord my inheritance account as collateral instead. $11,000 left to me by my mother after she passed away. Nearly everything I had at the time. "You used your inheritance," Daniel continued quietly. I remember because Richard told me nobody had ever believed in him like that before. I looked toward my husband then. Finally, Richard still refused to meet my eyes. The investor sitting beside Vanessa shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Well," he muttered awkwardly, "behind every successful man." "No," Daniel interrupted gently. "Not behind." The entire table fell silent again. "Beside," he finished. Something inside me trembled unexpectedly at that single word. Beside, not behind. I had not realized how long it had been since anyone placed me beside anything important. Vanessa forced another smile. "This is all very touching," she said carefully. "But Richard built an incredible company over 25 years. Daniel nodded calmly. "Yes, and I am beginning to understand exactly how." Richard finally looked at him directly then. "I think perhaps we are making tonight more personal than necessary." There it was. The polished executive tone. Controlled. Reasonable. Designed to make emotions sound unprofessional. It used to work on me every time. Whenever I felt hurt, Richard would calmly explain why I was overreacting. Whenever I questioned something, he reminded me how stressful leadership was. Over the years, I slowly learned to swallow disappointment before it became inconvenient. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. "You are right," he said calmly. "Tonight should absolutely be about recognition." Richard relaxed too soon. I saw it happen. Then Daniel continued, "Which is why I intend to correct something before this evening ends." Every muscle in Richard's face seemed to harden at once. Vanessa stared at Daniel carefully now, trying to calculate where the conversation was heading and whether she could still control it. Across the ballroom, more guests had started quietly watching table 1 instead of their own conversations. Even the photographers kept drifting closer. Richard noticed it too. His entire life revolved around image management, public perception, control, and for the first time in decades, control was slipping away from him in front of witnesses. "Daniel," Richard said carefully, lowering his voice, "perhaps we should discuss business privately later this week." Daniel smiled faintly. "This is business." Then he turned toward me again. "Evelyn, do you still write?" The question startled me. "Write? Articles? Analysis? Strategy papers?" I hesitated. "Sometimes." Richard immediately laughed softly. "Mostly as a hobby." Hobby. Another tiny word reducing entire parts of me into something harmless. I stared at the untouched coffee beside my dessert plate for several seconds before answering quietly. "I write at night mostly." Daniel watched me carefully. "Good," he said. "Because Reeves International is launching a manufacturing initiative next spring, and frankly, half the consultants I have interviewed sound less intelligent than the articles you published anonymously 10 years ago." I looked up sharply. "You knew those were mine?" He smiled. Immediately, Richard set his fork down harder than necessary against the china plate. The sound snapped quietly through the table conversation. Vanessa placed a calming hand against his arm beneath the candlelight, but this time I noticed something new in her expression. Fear. Not for me. For herself. Because if Daniel Reeves publicly connected me to real influence, then suddenly the harmless older wife they had carefully pushed into the background no longer looked harmless at all. The atmosphere at table 1 never fully recovered after Daniel mentioned the consulting initiative. Conversations continued around us, but they sounded thinner now, strained beneath the surface politeness wealthy people use when they sense scandal nearby. Richard kept adjusting his cufflinks every few minutes. Vanessa smiled too often, and for the first time all evening, I stopped trying to make them comfortable. It was such a small change that nobody else would have noticed it. I simply stopped apologizing with my body, stopped shrinking my shoulders inward, stopped lowering my eyes every time someone looked at me directly. Funny how exhausting invisibility becomes once you realize you have been performing it for years. A woman seated farther down the table leaned toward me after the coffee service arrived. "Mrs. Carter," she said warmly, "I would love to hear more about your operations work sometime." Before tonight, nobody at these events ever asked what I thought about anything. Usually they asked whether I enjoyed traveling or how many grandchildren I had. Questions soft enough to keep older women decorative. I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup before answering. "That is kind of you." "Nonsense," the woman replied immediately. "Daniel does not praise people lightly." Richard finally looked at me then. Not warmly, not proudly, carefully, like a man studying damage after a storm. "Evelyn always preferred staying out of the spotlight," he said calmly. There it was again, the narrative he had built around me for years. As though disappearance had been my preference instead of my adaptation. Daniel set down his napkin. "Are you certain about that?" Richard gave a small shrug. "She never complained." The words hit me harder than they should have. Because he was right. I had not complained. Not when my office inside the company slowly became storage space. Not when younger executives started assuming I was merely Richard's spouse during meetings I had once helped lead. Not when Vanessa began introducing herself publicly as the woman behind Carter Global's image strategy, while standing beside achievements built partly on my unpaid labor. Silence can become dangerous after enough years. People stop seeing it as endurance and start seeing it as consent. Daniel looked toward me instead of Richard. "Did you want more recognition?" he asked quietly. The question settled into my chest with surprising weight. I stared at the candle flickering between us, while memories rose one after another like old photographs pulled from dusty boxes. I remembered sitting at our kitchen table at 2 in the morning correcting contract language while Daniel slept upstairs with the flu. I remembered carrying accounting binders into the hospital maternity ward because payroll deadlines could not wait. I remembered teaching Richard how to speak confidently to investors while hiding my own exhaustion behind polite smiles. Recognition had never been the goal. Partnership was. "I wanted to matter," I said softly. Nobody spoke after that. Across the ballroom, a photographer snapped another series of pictures near the stage while guests pretended not to stare at our table. Richard shifted slightly in his seat. "You did matter," he said quickly. The desperation hidden beneath his calm voice startled me more than anger would have. For years I believed Richard no longer noticed me fading away. Tonight, I finally understood the truth. He noticed every bit of it. He simply benefited from it too much to stop it. Daniel folded his hands together thoughtfully. "Do you know what the biggest mistake most executives make after success?" he asked the table calmly. Nobody answered. "They start rewriting history in ways that flatter them." Richard forced a small laugh. "Surely all successful people do that a little." "Perhaps," Daniel replied. "But the intelligent ones understand something important." His eyes moved briefly toward me again. People eventually remember who carried the weight. Something shifted across several faces at the table then. Subtle, but visible. Respect beginning to rearrange itself. Earlier tonight, they saw me as background. Now they were recalculating everything they thought they understood about the Carter family. Vanessa noticed it too. She straightened slightly before speaking again with careful elegance. "Evelyn has always been incredibly supportive of Richard's career," she said. "She created a beautiful home life that allowed him to focus fully on leadership." Home life. Such polished language. As though I had simply arranged flowers while greatness happened elsewhere. "Interesting," Daniel murmured softly. Vanessa smiled politely. "Excuse me." He leaned back slightly in his chair. "I have spent 30 years leading international companies, and I have learned something very specific about intelligent women." Vanessa's smile faltered almost invisibly. "What is that?" "When they disappear from leadership conversations," Daniel said calmly, "it is rarely because they lack capability." The investor beside him coughed awkwardly into his napkin. Richard's jaw tightened again. I suddenly remembered another dinner nearly 12 years earlier. Richard had hosted several executives at our house in Lake Forest. I spent the entire afternoon preparing food while also helping him rehearse a major acquisition presentation upstairs between courses. During dinner, one executive complimented Richard on a brilliant logistics strategy involving regional distribution restructuring. Richard smiled proudly and accepted the praise while I quietly refilled water glasses beside the table. The strategy had been mine. Later that night, after the guests left, I asked him gently why he had not mentioned my involvement. He looked genuinely confused by the question. Because nobody wants to hear that the company's strategy came from my wife while she was marinating chicken in the kitchen, he said casually. Then he kissed my forehead and thanked me for a wonderful evening as though affection erased humiliation. At the time, I convinced myself he was probably right. Men like Richard survive by sounding singular, powerful, independent. Nobody celebrates the invisible architecture underneath them. But now, sitting beneath crystal chandeliers while another powerful man openly respected my mind, those old justifications sounded pathetic even inside my own memory. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly, then as someone stepped onto the stage to announce the final presentation of the evening. Richard visibly relaxed for the first time in over an hour. Public structure was returning. Scheduled speeches. Predictable applause. Territory he understood. Ladies and gentlemen, the announcer said warmly through the microphone, before tonight concludes, we would like to honor the extraordinary vision behind 25 years of Carter Global Innovations. Applause spread throughout the ballroom immediately. Richard stood automatically, smoothing the front of his tuxedo while cameras shifted toward the stage again. Vanessa touched his arm proudly. Everything looked polished once more from a distance. Controlled. Successful. But Daniel remained seated beside me. Calm. Watching. Richard Carter transformed a small regional operation into one of the most respected logistics companies in the country, the announcer continued. Tonight, we celebrate leadership, innovation, and legacy. A giant video montage began playing across the ballroom screens. More photographs. More interviews. More carefully edited history. Richard shaking hands. Richard giving speeches. Richard smiling beside politicians and investors, while dramatic orchestral music played underneath his accomplishments. I watched the montage quietly. 25 years reduced into a story with only one visible architect. Then suddenly the screen displayed an image I had not seen in decades. A photograph from the original Milwaukee office. Richard standing proudly near a whiteboard covered in handwritten calculations. And there beside him, partially cropped again but still visible, was me holding a marker while explaining something to 3 employees. The room barely noticed the image before the montage continued. But Daniel noticed. So did I. Interesting editing choice, he said quietly beside me. They left just enough of you visible to claim honesty. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Because that sentence described my entire marriage perfectly. Richard had never erased me completely. That would have looked cruel. Instead, he left tiny traces behind. Just enough visibility to avoid appearing guilty while still keeping the spotlight entirely for himself. The applause thundered again as the montage ended. Richard smiled confidently toward the crowd while preparing to step onto the stage for the final speech of the evening. Then Daniel Reeves slowly stood beside me. And the moment he rose, the entire ballroom fell silent again. The applause slowly faded as Daniel remained standing beside the table. Every eye in the ballroom shifted toward him immediately. That was the kind of presence powerful people carried without effort. Nobody needed to ask for attention when they had spent decades becoming impossible to ignore. Richard still stood near the stage waiting for the announcer to finish introducing him, but something uncertain had entered his posture now. The confidence remained on his face. The polished smile remained perfectly practiced. But I knew him too well not to recognize fear underneath it. Daniel picked up his champagne glass slowly. Before tonight concludes, he said calmly, his voice carrying easily across the silent ballroom, I would like to say a few words myself. The announcer looked startled for half a second before immediately stepping aside. Nobody told a man like Daniel Reeves no. Cameras turned toward him instantly. I stayed seated at table 1 with my hands folded quietly in my lap, suddenly aware of my own heartbeat again. Vanessa sat perfectly still across from me. Her expression remained composed, but the fingers around her wine glass had tightened enough to whiten her knuckles. Richard walked back toward the center stage slowly, trying to regain control of the evening before it drifted too far from his carefully designed narrative. Daniel stepped toward the microphone without hurry. 25 years ago, he began. Most people in this room had never heard the name Carter Global. Soft laughter moved politely through the crowd. Richard smiled again, relieved perhaps that the speech sounded supportive so far. Back then, Daniel continued, I was running a failing regional distribution company out of Cleveland. He glanced briefly toward me, and I met a woman who understood logistics, negotiation, and operational systems better than most executives twice her age. A quiet murmur spread instantly through the ballroom. Richard's smile weakened slightly. Daniel continued calmly. That woman was Evelyn Carter. The ballroom fell completely silent. I felt heat rise slowly into my face while dozens of strangers turned toward me all at once. For years I had learned how to disappear gracefully in rooms exactly like this. Suddenly disappearing was no longer possible. Daniel rested one hand lightly against the podium. Some people build companies loudly, he said. Others build them quietly while someone else stands at the microphone taking credit. No one moved after that sentence. Richard remained frozen near the edge of the stage, his face carefully controlled despite the tension visible around his mouth. Vanessa looked down briefly before recovering her expression again. Daniel continued speaking with the calm certainty of a man who no longer cared, whose feelings became uncomfortable. I still remember sitting in a freezing conference room in Cleveland during the winter of 1998 while investors prepared to walk away from my company forever. His eyes shifted toward me again. Evelyn Carter spent 6 hours reorganizing an entire distribution proposal by hand because our software system had crashed the night before. A few people laughed softly in disbelief. Daniel smiled faintly. Not only did she save that presentation, she corrected 3 major forecasting errors my own executive team completely missed. The room grew quieter with every sentence. The next morning, Daniel said, those investors approved the deal that eventually saved my company. He paused briefly, and afterward, when I asked Evelyn why she had helped me so much, she simply shrugged and said, because panic wastes time. Soft laughter spread again through the ballroom, warmer this time. Genuine. I lowered my eyes toward the table because suddenly emotion felt dangerously close to the surface. Not because of praise, because somebody remembered. Accurately. Completely. After years of being slowly rewritten into background decoration, hearing my own history spoken aloud felt almost unbearable. Daniel looked toward Richard then. So tonight, while we celebrate innovation and leadership, I believe we should also acknowledge the people history sometimes forgets too easily. The ballroom erupted into applause before he even finished speaking. Not polite applause. Real applause. Strong. Sustained. I stared down at the white tablecloth while the sound surrounded me from every direction. For a moment, I could not breathe properly. Richard clapped too. Of course he did. What else could he do with hundreds of people watching him? But I noticed he never looked directly at me while doing it. Daniel raised one hand gently, waiting for the applause to quiet again. In fact, he said calmly, I would like Evelyn Carter to join me on stage. The room exploded into applause a second time. Louder now. More cameras flashed near the front rows. I froze completely in my chair. Richard's face finally changed then. Not dramatically. He was too disciplined for that. But I saw something crack briefly behind his eyes. Because this moment was never supposed to happen. Not publicly. Not in front of investors and board members and photographers. I was supposed to remain seated near the edges of his life forever. Daniel stepped away from the microphone slightly and extended his hand toward me across the ballroom. Every person in that room turned to watch what I would do next. My hands trembled slightly as I pushed my chair back from the table. I had not stood on a stage in over 20 years. Not because I lacked capability. Because eventually I stopped believing anyone wanted to hear me anymore. The ballroom lights suddenly felt too bright. The distance toward the stage looked impossibly far. But then something unexpected happened. The woman seated beside me at table 1 reached over gently and squeezed my hand once. Go, she whispered softly. Around the ballroom, people continued applauding while I slowly rose to my feet. Vanessa avoided looking at me entirely now. Richard stood near the stage with his posture rigid as stone. I walked carefully between the tables while cameras followed every movement. Strange how different a room feels once people decide you matter. Earlier tonight, nobody noticed me standing alone beside the kitchen doors. Now executives moved aside to clear a path for me as though I belonged there all along. Daniel met me halfway toward the stage and offered his arm once again. This time when I accepted it, the applause somehow grew even louder. He guided me gently onto the stage beside him beneath the massive, glowing Carter Global logo. I looked out across the ballroom and saw hundreds of faces staring back at me. Curious, respectful, interested. For years I had sat quietly at charity dinners and company galas, while conversations flowed around me as though I had already become invisible with age. Suddenly the room felt different. Not because I had changed overnight, because someone important finally acknowledged I had always been there. Daniel handed me the microphone carefully. "I believe," he said softly enough that only I could hear him, "they should hear from you directly for once." My throat tightened instantly. I stared down at the microphone in my hands while the ballroom waited in complete silence. Richard looked almost pale beneath the stage lights now. Vanessa sat motionless near the front table. Somewhere deep in the ballroom, a camera shutter clicked repeatedly. For a second I considered refusing, returning the microphone politely, letting Richard reclaim control of the evening. That version of myself still existed somewhere inside me. The woman trained to smooth tension away before it became inconvenient. But then I looked toward the giant company logo hanging above the stage. 25 years. 25 years of watching myself slowly disappear from my own story. And suddenly I realized something simple. Silence had protected everyone except me. I lifted the microphone slowly. The ballroom remained perfectly still. Then finally, after decades of shrinking myself smaller so other people could feel larger, I spoke. I held the microphone with both hands because suddenly they did not feel entirely steady anymore. Hundreds of faces stared back at me beneath the ballroom lights. Executives, investors, reporters, people who had spent years applauding my husband while never once wondering who stood quietly beside him after the cameras disappeared. For a second, I could hear nothing except the soft hum of the stage speakers and the pounding of my own heartbeat. Then I looked toward Richard. He stood near the edge of the stage with his smile frozen into place so tightly it no longer looked human. And strangely enough, seeing that expression calmed me. Because for the first time in years, I was not the only one feeling exposed. I lifted the microphone slightly closer. "I do not usually speak at events like this," I said softly. A few people laughed gently, relieved perhaps to hear a calm voice instead of confrontation. Mostly because I stopped believing anyone wanted to hear from me. Silence settled over the ballroom again. Not uncomfortable silence this time. Listening silence. I glanced briefly toward Daniel Reeves beside me. He gave the smallest nod. So I continued. 25 years ago, Richard and I were living in a 2-bedroom apartment with peeling wallpaper and exactly one reliable car. A few soft smiles appeared around the room. The company did not have an office yet. We worked from our kitchen table. Some nights we used towels to block cold air from coming through the windows because we could not afford better insulation. Richard lowered his eyes briefly. I wondered if he remembered those nights the same way I did. Back then, I continued, success looked very different from this ballroom. I gestured lightly toward the chandeliers, the expensive floral arrangements, the polished marble floors. Success meant making payroll for 3 employees. Success meant finding enough money to repair delivery trucks before contracts fell apart. Success meant eating canned soup for dinner because every extra dollar needed to go back into the business. Several people nodded quietly now, not because the story sounded glamorous, because it sounded real. Richard worked very hard, I said carefully. He believed in the company before anyone else did. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him visibly relax for a second. He thought I was restoring the version of history he preferred. Then I continued speaking. And so did I. The room became completely still again. I handled accounting during the early years, I said. Contracts, payroll, scheduling, vendor negotiations, forecasting. I smiled faintly, sometimes while holding a baby on my hip. A few people laughed softly again, but this time the laughter carried warmth instead of politeness. I did not mind the work. I continued honestly. I loved building something with someone I believed in. That part remained true no matter how painful the rest had become. Richard, and I were not always strangers standing beneath ballroom lights pretending our marriage still fit properly. Once upon a time, we truly had been partners. But somewhere along the way, I said quietly, I became less visible inside the story we built together. No one moved. No one looked away. At first it happened slowly. I continued. One interview where my name was forgotten. One meeting where I stopped being invited. One introduction where I became Richard's wife instead of Evelyn. I looked down briefly at the microphone in my hands. Then eventually I stopped correcting people because I convinced myself it did not matter. Across the ballroom, I noticed several women watching me very carefully now. Older women mostly. Women with elegant jewelry and practiced smiles. Women who probably understood far more than anyone openly admitted in rooms like this. I think many people assume disappearing happens all at once, I said softly. But it usually does not. It happens one quiet compromise at a time. Richard shifted near the stage again. He still had not interrupted me. Not because he wanted me to speak freely. Because stopping me now would destroy him publicly in ways even he could not repair. There is something strange about growing older, I continued. People begin speaking around you instead of to you. They assume your best years exist only in the past. They start introducing younger versions of themselves to replace you while you are still standing there smiling politely. Vanessa's face tightened almost imperceptibly across the ballroom floor. I did not look directly at her again after that. I did not need to. Tonight, I said, I arrived here believing my role was simply to stay out of the way. My voice remained calm, but I could hear emotion pressing quietly beneath it now. And honestly, I had become very good at that. The silence deepened. Then Daniel Reeves remembered me more clearly than I had remembered myself. Daniel lowered his head slightly beside me, almost humbled by the statement. That matters more than I can properly explain. I paused then, taking one careful breath before continuing. Because eventually, after enough years of being treated like background decoration, you begin wondering whether you truly were important at all. Somewhere near the front tables, a woman dabbed carefully beneath her eyes with a napkin. Even some of the men looked uncomfortable now, though not in the way Richard feared earlier. This was not scandal discomfort. This was recognition. I am not saying this tonight because I want sympathy, I continued. And I am certainly not saying it because I regret helping build Carter Global. I looked toward the giant glowing company logo above the ballroom stage. I am proud of what we created. Then slowly, very slowly, I turned toward Richard. But partnership should not require disappearance. The sentence landed quietly across the room like a glass setting down too hard against a table. Richard finally looked directly at me again. Really looked at me. Not as an inconvenience. Not as an aging wife he needed to manage carefully in public. For the first time in years, he looked uncertain. I think that frightened him more than anger would have. Daniel stepped slightly closer beside me. Not protectively, respectfully, like a man standing beside an equal. People deserve to be remembered accurately, he said quietly into the microphone beside mine. The ballroom erupted into applause before either of us could continue. Loud applause. Sustained applause. Not because I delivered some dramatic speech filled with revenge or humiliation. Because honesty sounds shocking after years of polished performance. I lowered the microphone slowly while the room stood clapping around us. Several people rose to their feet entirely. Investors, executives, strangers. And standing there beneath all that applause, I felt something I had not felt in decades. Not vindication. Not triumph. Space. Space inside myself where shame used to live. Richard remained near the stage applauding too because he had no other choice left. But his expression looked hollow now. Like a man suddenly realizing the story he spent years carefully editing no longer belonged entirely to him. Daniel leaned toward me quietly while the applause continued around us. There is one more thing they should know, he said softly. I frowned slightly. Daniel, but he had already reached gently for the microphone again. The ballroom slowly quieted once more as he stepped forward beneath the stage lights. There is another reason I have spent years trying to find Evelyn Carter, he said calmly. Richard's face changed immediately. Instinct, fear, recognition. Whatever Daniel planned to say next, my husband already knew exactly how dangerous it would be. The applause faded slowly through the ballroom, but the tension remained suspended in the air like smoke after a fire. Daniel stood beside me beneath the stage lights with one hand resting lightly against the microphone stand. His expression had changed again. Softer before, more serious now. I looked toward Richard instinctively. He no longer appeared angry. Anger would have required confidence. What I saw instead was calculation. The kind a person makes when they realize a situation has slipped beyond recovery and survival becomes the only remaining objective. Daniel glanced toward me briefly before continuing. About 8 years ago, he said calmly, Reeves International prepared to expand our manufacturing operations across the Midwest. Several executives in the audience nodded immediately. Everyone in the business world remembered that expansion. It had changed entire regional distribution systems across the country. At the time, Daniel continued, we invited proposals from several logistics firms, including Carter Global. Richard's face tightened. I suddenly remembered that contract. Of course I did. Richard had spent months obsessing over it. Winning Reeves International would elevate Carter Global permanently into a different level of corporate influence. I remembered long nights reviewing forecasts beside him while he paced across our home office too anxious to sleep. I also remembered the argument we had 6 weeks before the final presentation. Your projections are wrong, I told him carefully while reviewing the numbers at our kitchen table. The Western distribution costs are going to collapse under fuel volatility within 18 months. Richard barely looked up from his laptop. The consultants disagree. Your consultants are using outdated transportation assumptions, I insisted quietly. You need decentralized inventory placement or the margins will fail. He sighed heavily back then. Tired. Irritated. Evelyn, he said, please stop treating every conversation like you are still running operations. Still, such a small word. As though capability expired with age. I remembered sitting there quietly afterward while he returned to his spreadsheets without me. That night, I stayed awake alone until nearly 3 in the morning redesigning the logistics structure myself, because despite everything, I still wanted him to succeed. The memory hit me so suddenly on stage that my chest physically tightened. Daniel's voice pulled me back into the ballroom. Most companies submitted standard regional consolidation proposals, he explained calmly to the audience. Except one. He looked directly toward me. One proposal contained a logistics restructuring model so advanced that my executive board initially assumed it came from an outside consulting firm. A murmur spread quietly through the crowd. Richard stared at the floor now. That proposal, Daniel continued, was the reason Carter Global won the contract. My fingers tightened around the microphone still resting in my hands. I knew what he was about to say before he said it. Somewhere deep down, Richard knew too. The problem, Daniel said quietly, was that I later discovered Richard Carter did not write that proposal. Complete silence swallowed the ballroom. No one even pretended to move now. Cameras flashed once, twice, then stopped entirely as photographers realized something far more valuable than staged corporate smiles was unfolding in front of them. Daniel's voice remained calm, almost gentle, which somehow made every word hit harder. I recognized the writing style immediately, he said. The analytical structure, the forecasting patterns, the operational sequencing. He looked at me carefully. It was Evelyn's work. The room seemed to shift beneath my feet. Not because I felt exposed, because hearing the truth spoken aloud after carrying it silently for so many years felt almost unreal. Richard finally looked up sharply. Daniel, he interrupted carefully. That is an oversimplification. Oversimplification. Another polished corporate word hiding panic underneath it. Daniel remained composed. Is it? Richard stepped forward slightly onto the stage now, reclaiming some of his executive posture. Evelyn reviewed portions of the proposal, he said evenly. But ultimately the strategic direction belonged to Carter Global Leadership. Leadership, meaning himself. I stared at him quietly while memories continued surfacing whether I wanted them to or not. I remembered that proposal line by line because I wrote nearly all of it after Richard discarded my original concerns. 3 weeks before the presentation, fuel cost projections shifted exactly the way I warned him they would. Suddenly his entire model became unstable. He came into the kitchen after midnight carrying folders and shaking hands. I need help, he admitted quietly back then. I helped him. Of course I did. I rewrote the logistics structure from scratch over 4 nights, while he slept upstairs before investor meetings. When the contract succeeded, Richard bought me a bracelet and thanked me privately over dinner. Then publicly he accepted every ounce of credit alone. Daniel looked toward the audience again. 2 years later, he continued calmly. Our board attempted to recruit the person responsible for that proposal. My stomach dropped slightly. The letters, the invitations, Boston, all the opportunities one never knew existed. Every communication disappeared, Daniel said. No responses, no return calls, nothing. Richard's face had become almost colorless beneath the stage lights now. Vanessa sat perfectly motionless near table 1, though I noticed she no longer looked embarrassed. She looked frightened, because suddenly the carefully crafted mythology surrounding Richard Carter was cracking publicly in ways no public relations strategy could easily repair. Eventually, Daniel continued, I assumed Evelyn simply chose retirement. He paused briefly. Tonight, I discovered something else entirely. Silence spread through the ballroom again. Heavy, unavoidable. Richard stepped fully toward the microphone then. I think this conversation is becoming deeply inappropriate for a celebration event. His voice remained controlled, but I heard the strain underneath it now. Private family matters should remain private. Family matters. I almost laughed at that. For years my disappearance benefited his public image perfectly. Now suddenly privacy mattered. Daniel glanced toward him calmly. You are right, he said. This is not really about family. Richard frowned slightly. Daniel continued. This is about professional theft. Audible gasps spread quietly through the ballroom. Vanessa immediately stood from her table. That is an unfair accusation, she said sharply before softening her tone again. Richard built this company over decades. Daniel nodded once. And Evelyn helped build it too. He turned toward me then. The difference is that one name disappeared from the public narrative while the other became famous. I looked out across the ballroom again. Earlier tonight, I arrived here, believing invisibility was simply part of aging. Something older women accepted gracefully while younger, shinier versions of life moved forward without them. But standing beneath those lights now, hearing the truth spoken aloud without apology, I realized invisibility is rarely accidental. Someone usually benefits from it. Richard rubbed one hand slowly across his forehead before speaking again. Evelyn never objected, he said quietly. The sentence hurt more than anything else that evening, because buried inside it was the truth I hated most. He genuinely believed silence meant permission. Daniel looked at me carefully. Did you? The ballroom waited. Every face turned toward me again. Richard finally looked uncertain in a way I had never seen before during our entire marriage. Not because he feared losing business contracts. Because for the first time, he genuinely did not know what I would say. I stared at him for several seconds beneath the ballroom lights. Then I answered honestly. At first, I said softly, I thought sacrifice was part of love. Complete silence. Then eventually, I continued. I forgot where sacrifice ended and erasure began. Somewhere in the audience, a woman quietly started crying. Not dramatically, just silently beneath the soft glow of the chandeliers. Daniel stepped back slightly then, giving me space instead of speaking for me again. And suddenly I understood what made this moment so overwhelming. It was not revenge. Revenge would have required anger. What I felt instead was grief. Grief for the younger version of myself who kept shrinking smaller because she believed loyalty would eventually be noticed. Richard stared at me like he no longer recognized the woman standing beside him on that stage. The truth was, maybe he never really had. No one applauded after my last sentence. The ballroom remained completely silent beneath the chandeliers, as though the entire room had finally become too honest for performance. Richard stood only a few feet away from me on that stage, but he looked farther away than he had in years. Older too. I noticed that suddenly. The deep lines near his mouth. The exhaustion beneath the careful grooming. For decades I had spent so much energy protecting his image that I forgot he was simply a man. Flawed. Afraid. Desperate to remain admired. Daniel Reeves stepped slightly back from the microphone again, allowing the silence to settle naturally instead of rushing to fill it. Wealthy people rarely experience silence without control attached to it. Tonight, nobody knew how to manage what was happening anymore. Finally, Richard cleared his throat softly. I think perhaps, he said carefully, people are misunderstanding the realities of marriage and business partnerships over long periods of time. His voice sounded steady again now. Executive. Controlled. He was rebuilding himself sentence by sentence. Evelyn and I made sacrifices together, he continued. Every successful family divides responsibilities differently. A few uncertain nods appeared around the ballroom. Some people wanted desperately for the situation to become simple again. Respectable. Daniel watched him quietly without interruption. Richard turned slightly toward the audience. My wife chose to focus more on family life, while I handled the public demands of the business. Chose. That word again. Such a clean little lie because technically it was never entirely false. I did choose family many times. I chose to leave meetings early when Daniel had pneumonia. I chose to manage payroll from home while caring for Richard's mother after her surgery. I chose to stay awake balancing invoices after midnight because our son needed help with school projects during the day. But choice becomes complicated when every available option slowly erases you anyway. Richard looked toward me then, softening his expression carefully for the audience. I never intended for Evelyn to feel unappreciated. Unappreciated. Another gentle word avoiding the truth entirely. He still could not say invisible. Daniel folded his hands calmly beside us. Intent and outcome are not always the same thing. Richard's jaw tightened again. And public humiliation helps no one. That sentence changed the room slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough for people to understand what mattered most to him even now. Not grief. Not regret. Humiliation. Daniel noticed it too. Interesting, he said softly. You believe this evening is humiliating for you. Richard stared at him without answering. Daniel continued quietly. I imagine 20 years of erasure felt humiliating too. The ballroom remained painfully still. Vanessa finally stood from her table near the front again. This time her composure looked more fragile than elegant. I think we should all take a step back, she said carefully. This was supposed to be a celebration. I looked toward her for the first time in several minutes. She seemed younger suddenly. Not weak exactly. Just inexperienced in moments where image alone could not fix reality. You are right, I said softly into the microphone. It was supposed to be. Vanessa hesitated slightly, perhaps surprised I addressed her directly. Evelyn, she said, nobody was trying to hurt you. Hurt. Another soft word. Everyone in that ballroom seemed addicted to soft words tonight. I looked at her calmly beneath the stage lights. Vanessa, I asked gently, why was my name listed as guest tonight? Complete silence. Her face changed immediately. Tiny things. The stiffness near her mouth. The quick glance toward Richard. That was an event coordination issue, she answered quickly. Was it? I asked. She opened her mouth again, but stopped. Because both of us knew the truth. Vanessa had spent years carefully redesigning the public image of Carter Global. Younger executives. Modern branding. Lifestyle magazine interviews featuring polished family photographs where I slowly disappeared farther toward the edges until eventually I vanished completely. She once told me quietly during a holiday party, people connect more with forward-looking leadership images. At the time I smiled politely and carried dessert plates back into the kitchen. Now I finally understood what she really meant. Older women complicated the fantasy of modern success. Daniel watched the exchange carefully. Image management becomes dangerous, he said quietly to the audience, when human beings start getting edited out along with outdated logos. Several uncomfortable laughs moved weakly through the ballroom. Richard stepped closer to the microphone suddenly. Enough, he said sharply. The word echoed harder than he intended through the silent room. For the first time all evening, genuine emotion cracked through his polished executive tone. He immediately noticed it too and lowered his voice again. This conversation has gone far beyond appropriate. Appropriate. I almost smiled sadly. It was never considered inappropriate when I disappeared quietly. Only when someone finally noticed. Richard looked directly at me now. Evelyn, he said softly. We can discuss this privately at home. Home. The word landed strangely inside me. I pictured our house in Lake Forest with its enormous windows and spotless kitchen counters and quiet hallways where I had spent years speaking softer and softer until eventually silence became easier. I pictured the upstairs office where Richard framed magazine covers featuring himself while my old accounting binders sat boxed in storage downstairs beside Christmas decorations. Home no longer sounded comforting. It sounded managed. I do not think there is much left to discuss privately, I answered honestly. The ballroom inhaled collectively at that sentence. Richard stared at me like he genuinely did not understand who I had become over the last 2 hours. The truth was simpler than that. I had not changed. I had simply stopped editing myself for his comfort. Daniel glanced toward the audience briefly before speaking again. Earlier tonight, he said calmly, I was prepared to announce a major strategic partnership initiative involving Carter Global. Immediate whispers spread across the ballroom. Investors straightened in their seats. Board members exchanged quick looks. Richard's entire attention snapped toward Daniel instantly. There it was. The one language he still understood completely. Business. Daniel continued evenly. The project would have involved a multi-state manufacturing expansion beginning next spring. Vanessa's face drained of color slightly. Richard stepped forward. Daniel, he said carefully, surely tonight is not the appropriate moment to discuss contracts. Daniel remained calm. Actually, I think tonight revealed exactly what kind of leadership decisions matter. The ballroom became so quiet I could hear silverware shifting somewhere near the back tables. Richard's breathing looked heavier now beneath the stage lights. You are making an emotional decision, he said. Daniel smiled faintly. No, I am making a professional one. Then he looked directly toward me. Because, frankly, the most competent strategist connected to Carter Global appears to have been sitting unrecognized near the kitchen doors at the beginning of this evening. A few shocked laughs escaped through the crowd. I felt heat rise into my face again, but this time shame did not follow it. Richard rubbed one hand slowly across his mouth before speaking again. What exactly are you suggesting? Daniel's expression remained unreadable. I am suggesting, he said calmly, that Reeves International would like to formally offer Evelyn Carter an executive consulting position for our Midwest expansion initiative. The ballroom erupted instantly. Gasps, whispers, shocked voices rising together beneath the chandeliers. Somewhere near the front row, someone actually dropped a champagne glass. I stood frozen beneath the stage lights, unable to breathe properly for a second. Consulting position. Executive level. Not honorary. Not symbolic. Real. Richard looked at me, then with an expression I had never seen on his face before during our entire marriage. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Fear. Because suddenly the woman he spent years quietly reducing had become impossible to contain again.